All right. So Senator Dede Feldman is the first woman elected as a New Mexico senator from Albuquerque's near North Valley, and the author of 3 books about politics and change in New Mexico. Dede Feldman has been a pioneer for women in government. She has a long history of promoting campaign finance reform, improved health insurance in New Mexico, and election reform. Feldman built her foundation for change with a varied career as a journalist, high school and university teacher, and the owner of a small public relations business. As a senator for District 13 from 1997 to 2012, Feldman had a big impact on the lives of women, children, and people struggling to make ends meet. All right, thank you.
Well, thank you. I guess that's my cue. I'll try to keep this kind of informal. And since it's a Saturday afternoon and it's a fairly small group, as informal as it can be on Zoom, but at least it is possible to bring all these folks together. And I first want to thank Janet Phillips and the Jemez Springs Public Library, which is a great little library. And like so many rural libraries in New Mexico, underfunded, mainly supported by volunteers. And this past week or so, they developed a leak in the roof, a bad time to have a leak in the roof with all this snow. So they're now in the process of fixing it. And I'm hoping to contribute in my little way by donating the proceeds of any books that are sold as a result of this event. So I also want to thank Stephanie Garcia Richard, who agreed to write the foreword to this book and who I know was your representative up there in Jemez Springs for many years. And she was great. Yeah, I see some high okay signs. She's now the state's first female land commissioner, which is a great thing. And she took me in to see the pictures of all the land commissioners past, and she's the only woman. And it's such a great contrast because this is such a important but overlooked post that really does a lot for New Mexico in terms of the huge amount of public lands that we have in this state. So I wanted to make those thanks, and especially mention Stephanie, because in writing this book, which is kind of my story, and it's very different than any of the other books that I've written, because I always tried to have a very journalistic and somewhat objective third-person style. And this is clearly a memoir, and I'm now finally using the dreaded I word, so it's different. But the target audience, to some degree, was young people that, like Stephanie, that were interested in politics, interested in making a contribution in some way, either as a candidate or as the impetus for a new nonprofit, as a journalist. There are a lot of young people around who need a little nudge in these very hard times to do what they've proven to be doing really magnificently, certainly last year in the national election, where the efforts of young people were very, very much apparent, especially in Arizona. And so I wanted to say a few words at the beginning here about the New Mexico legislature, which is in session now, just past the halfway point. And I think that I would be remiss if I didn't mention that fact, and say that I am still very much involved with it, even though I'm not a senator anymore and haven't been for about 10 years. I am working as a consultant and a communications strategic planner for Common Cause New Mexico, which some of you may know is a good government group at a national level established after Watergate by John Gardner, because it was felt, as he said, their special interests have many, many lobbyists in Washington, D.C., but the people don't have a lobbyist when it comes to good government, fair elections, removing the interests of special interests on our political process, which is what Common Cause tries to do. And it's been busy recently, last year and this year, for those kinds of efforts. So anyway, this, as you know, is a short session of the legislature. It's a 30-day session. And those 30-day sessions of the legislature, which occur in even-numbered years, according to the New Mexico Constitution, are confined to budget and taxation issues, except if the governor puts issues on what they call the call, or on the agenda for the session. And this year, in spite of the short time frame, the governor has put a tremendous number of issues on the call, and the legislature is dealing with them right now. Their main job, of course, is to produce a budget for the state of New Mexico. And the House just passed the budget, House Bill 2, and it's now over on the Senate side, where the Senate then amends the budget. Just the important thing to know is that New Mexico is awash in money. It has a budget this year of $8.5 billion. I mean, and if you know anything about New Mexico, that's a huge amount, even compared to the 5 years. But even before that, when I started in the late 90s, the budget was about $2 billion. And we thought that was a lot. And 30 days, well, we were even hard pressed to spend it in 30 days. So imagine now what it's like to deal with that. And part of it is funding from the federal government for COVID and for infrastructure. And now we also have a surplus as a result of the increasing price of oil and gas. So that is a good problem to have in some respects, and a bad problem to have in some respects, because it indicates how very dependent we are on oil and gas revenue in New Mexico. So some of the things that the governor, and of course it's an election year too. So some of the things that the governor has put on her agenda this year are big items, very big items. There's a proposal for major increases in the education area, pay hikes for educators, long overdue here, salary raises. And I think the beginning salary of a teacher in New Mexico would be over $50,000 a year for the first time. And there are proposals for a lengthened school year, and many other proposals in that area. Also, crime is a big issue, maybe the biggest issue in the session. And there are a number of different bills there to not only increase the number of police, but also to change a pretrial detention, which is a very controversial item, which some say would take criminals off the street, and others say would hold people who are presumed innocent in jail against the whole constitutional idea of innocent until proven guilty. So that's a big controversial issue. And it looks like it was stymied in the House, and it's now been reintroduced in the Senate. There's also the governor has also made a big proposal for a hydrogen hub in New Mexico, touting hydrogen fuel as an alternative fuel that will get us to a carbon neutral future. There's been unanimous opposition from 30 environmental groups in New Mexico and others who say that this will be producing more methane and more carbon than it will be saving, and that the technology is just not there yet, that it might be there in a number of years, but right now it's not there. So anyway, so that also died in the first committee that it came before in the House. And according to all reports, the governor is not happy. She's not happy that some of her projects, big initiatives, are hitting the reality of the legislature. She's also got a what I consider to be a really great bill of voters' rights. And in the wake of the defeat of this bill in Washington, this is a very important issue. And this is a pretty sweeping bill that would make Election Day a holiday, that would ease automatic voter registration at the MVD, that would give you the right to request an absentee ballot one time and get it for every election. If for example, you lived in a rural area or were over 75 and unable to easily get to the polls. And a lot of good measures in there to ease Native American voting too, which was problematic this past year, largely because of COVID and the location of early voting sites inaccessible to the tribes. So as other states are beginning to restrict voter rights and even in some cases give the legislatures the power to override the popular vote, New Mexico's going in the opposite direction under the leadership of Maggie Toulouse-Oliver. And I'm really proud of us. This bill also has hit roadblocks and snags and is still trying to get out of its first committee. But nonetheless, this is a very good thing and something, in my view, and something that I'm working on for common cause, as I am for a lot of ethics and transparency issues. And, that's kind of part of the theme of my book also, and that is that you don't have to be a New Mexico senator. You don't have to be a city councilor or a county commissioner or a governor to make a real difference. And you can have an impact on the inside and on the outside. There's inside games and outside games. But the important thing is to keep your paddle in the water and to keep at it over time. I was not able to pass a lot of the stuff that I wanted to pass, although I had tremendous success in many areas. Some of the big stuff I was not able to do, although I tried for over a decade in some cases. We tried to get an ethics commission in New Mexico. I sponsored that repeatedly and helped others, and it wasn't possible while I was a senator. But then afterwards, when I got out, we were able to get a constitutional amendment on the ballot to get an ethics commission to deal with some of these embarrassing episodes of corruption in the New Mexico legislature and outside the New Mexico legislature. But it wasn't until I was on the outside that I was able to do that. So, you know, that's why I keep involved and why I really urge you all to keep involved too. We have such a great and accessible legislature in New Mexico. And I really urge you, if you don't know, if you are not familiar with the legislative website, to go to www.nmlegis.gov. And you will see there that you're able to tune in to floor sessions, to committee sessions, to contact your legislator to find out what the bills are that they're sponsoring. And one of your current representative, Christine Chandler, is sponsoring one that I noticed today about fentanyl, which is just ruining our state with drug overdoses. And she's got a good bill that will allow drug addicts access to a test which shows them whether their drugs are tainted with this deadly substance. It's similar to the harm reduction bill that we passed when I first got to the legislature in 1997. Those are some of the issues before the legislature and how you can get involved. I just want to say to people, 30 days is not enough to take care of all this, not even the really fully consider a budget. And yet we are stuck with that because of our state constitution, which provides only for short sessions in even 30 days, in even numbered years, which provides for an unpaid legislature except for per diems, and which also provides for a staffless legislature during the interim, which makes it very difficult to consider highly complex issues like hydrogen and you know, even voting rights for a lot of the people who are not familiar with, you know, the ins and outs of how a county clerk operates, for example. So I dealt with some of the deficiencies of this kind of setup inside the New Mexico Senate. It would take a constitutional amendment to change it. But I think that there are a number of bills introduced to study it and to do something like that. But I think actually our progress as a state depends upon modernizing our citizens' legislature. So, okay, enough about the legislature. And let's talk about 10 More Doors and why I wrote it. I did write it last year from my place in Jemez Springs during a time of COVID and also during the most extraordinary year that we have had politically in my lifetime, certainly, the Trump era. And, you know, one of the things about a memoir, and some of you have written some or along those lines of a memoir, is you have really two people when you're writing something like that. Is you have the person that you were maybe 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and the person that you are today, looking back and remembering what those events were, how you felt about them then. And, you know, they may be two different things. And what you do remember, of course, is a function of the context that you're living in today. And so this book is, as all memoirs are, I think, a reflection of the times that I was writing it in. And that was last year, 2021 and into 2022. And what I was kind of examining in this book is whether some of the values, some of my bedrock values that I had since high school, whether they were still valid, whether they were obsolete now. And these were these I think there are questions that everyone my age is asking, and that is whether our motivating assumptions like facts matter and science counts and there will always be free and fair elections where the majority rules, whether it's inside a legislative body or whether it's at the polling place or whether it's in a electoral college, and whether it's still important to have an independent judiciary and an executive that is not above the law. All those things are threatened. And I thought naively at first that we made a narrow escape in actually electing an alternative to an authoritarian figure. And of course, then came January 6th and the aftermath of January 6th, in which we are still seeing this alternative reality occupying our political life, our media, at every level, really, when it comes to COVID, when it comes to journalism, and whether we can trust, and it basically has eroded public trust. So those are some of the questions that I was kind of the undercurrent of this book. So a little bit about my background that you may not know about, and that is that I come from Pennsylvania, outside of Philadelphia. That's where I was brought up. I was brought up in a Quaker background. I went to Quaker schools. My high school had tunnels built underneath it where escaped slaves resided on the Underground Railroad on the way to Canada. Colonial America also was just a part of my psyche there. I walked by a statue of Benjamin Franklin every day when I went to the University of Pennsylvania. My father was an antique dealer and a newspaper editor. And so I brought all that kind of baggage, so to speak, with me when I came to New Mexico in 1975, following my husband, Mark, that some of you know him. And he's coming here to enroll in the New Mexico Architecture School, a master's program there. And at that time, 1975, New Mexico was a hotbed of pioneering passive solar energy, alternative technology of all types. And we were really drawn to that because it was so different from the traditions of the East Coast. And not only that, but we were drawn to Albuquerque and New Mexico because of its ethnic mix, and bought a small house in the North Valley in 1976 and renovated it as an experiment in passive solar energy. And this was in a neighborhood that was very mixed. It was a working class, and we still live here, a very working class neighborhood in the North Valley near Old Town. And it was inhabited by Hispanics mostly, who worked for the post office. In fact, it was called the Post Office Edition when it was started. Very near the Cochiti Elementary School, if some of you know that area. And we loved it. And we built this house and laid the adobes ourselves. And our neighbors were mixing mud in a big pit in the front yard with hose, and we couldn't afford a mixer. And so finally our neighbors just kept driving by and looking at what all these crazy gringos were doing, and stopped and then offered to show us how to lay adobes in the right way. We were not doing it right. How to peel latillas that we had gathered from the Jemez to make a latilla ceiling, and how to build kiva fireplaces. And that was my introduction to the North Valley as a community, as a diverse community. So a lot of this book, as the cover indicates, is about knocking on doors, walking around neighborhoods with a clipboard, very much listening to people at street level, and finding out what some of their concerns was. Everybody told me in 1995, which was when I first ran for office, and I first ran for the Albuquerque City Council and lost by 9 votes. Thought I would never do it again. But then an opening appeared in the New Mexico Senate, and I ran again and won fairly overwhelmingly. I think people felt guilty because they didn't show up before or something. And but anyway, everybody told me I could not win because I had the valley was populated with people whose names were Martinez or Sanchez or Griegos or Sandoval or other common names around here. And I didn't have a name like that. I didn't have a large family. I didn't go to Our Lady of Guadalupe Church or St. Therese or any of the other churches around here. So, the theory is that, it's based on ethnic voting. If you're an Anglo, you can't win in an area that's a majority Hispanic area. And I didn't know whether that was true or not. I thought it would be best to act as if it wasn't true. And so I just started out going door to door and letting people find out for themselves if I was a threat to anything they held dear. This is a very democratic area too. So that's what I did. And the book is about what I found out going door to door from ordinary people. And since this is a kind of a book reading, I think I'll read a passage from the book. And it's on page, for those of you who have the book, it's on page 95 from a chapter called At Street Level. And here it was. By the time I had won the Democratic primary in June of 1996, I had walked almost every street in the North Valley, from Montano south to Central, and from the river on the west to I-25 on the east. I had been bitten by dogs. I had lost 20 pounds, spoken to homemakers at kitchen tables covered in oilcloths, and waited politely when tough guys washing their cars in the driveway wouldn't stop to talk. I bought lemonade from the neighborhood kids every chance I got, and I went inside when I shouldn't have. I wrote thank you notes to every person I spoke with. I returned every phone call. My first instinct was right. If I simply got to know people in person, they would see that I was not a threat. Now I knew the community. its fears, hopes, complaints, jokes, habits, tastes, and hot buttons. My newfound community, with its liberal and tolerant spirit, would sustain me for 16 years as I grew as a public servant. But it was the magic, the ups and downs, and the synchronicity of my initial door-to-door campaigns, first for the city council and then for the Senate, that made me into the senator I became. For about a year, I had been a street person on foot, without a car, armed only with a clipboard. I saw things I had never noticed, although they had been there all along. I smelled the horses on Matthew Avenue, right in the middle of the city, and saw kids throwing rocks into the ditches. I knew what time the mail was delivered in the Corley Holmes edition and whether the trash had been picked up on Thursday. I discovered a tower of sneakers, a street side art gallery on Camillo Lane, and heard the sound of the Valley High School band practicing. I saw countless old cars parked in front yards, waiting for a missing part. I even got into one to talk to a lonely veteran whose wife had died. I smelled the green chili roasting and saw families gathering to peel off the skin. Sometimes I would hear the sandhill cranes calling and lift my eyes to follow their V-shaped formations as they made their way south. The houses facing the streets I had driven along for years now had inhabitants I knew. The Garcia family on Rio Grande and the Royballs on Griegos. I had seen what was in the backyards, out of view, a giant Buddha behind a modest home on Candelaria, an illegal mother-in-law dwelling on San Lorenzo, a treehouse on Los Arboles, or a sweat lodge off of Rio Grande. I never bothered much with the details of ordinary life. I thought I had better things to do, to accomplish on a higher level. Now I listened, I watched, and learned about the lives of ordinary people who became extraordinary, and in some cases, even heroic to me. These stories I heard during that year, stories of hardship, of success, of mental illness, and religious belief, stuck with me and formed the backdrop of the policies I promoted and the laws I made in the New Mexico Senate. So you can see that for me anyway, and I think for a lot of people, campaigns were really a transformative experience and a lesson in listening, a lesson in how powerless most people feel they are when they're really grappling with big problems, and what a community is all about. I went searching for votes, but what I found was a community. And in some ways, that's what we're all searching for. And so I was lucky to get that experience. And apparently it's an experience that others have had. And one of them was one of my heroes and mentors that I quote in the book. And that is progressive Minnesota U.S. Senator Paul Wellstone. I'm sure some of you know of him. And he said, most of my politics comes from people who should be famous, but hardly anyone knows their names. People that I've just met in different communities or neighborhoods who are very inspiring, who have made all the difference. That's what I most believe in. And that's certainly, something that I believe in too. Just to wrap up here, just a number of people have asked me to cut to the chase. What are some of the lessons then of this book and what you learned as a candidate, as a journalist? And I was a journalist before I was a senator and and participated in many different campaigns. And what I learned from those experiences, and in this book, you'll find them, are some lessons. And one of them is obvious from the title, and that is keep knocking, whatever you're doing. It's a long game and you're going to have losses. I had losses and some of them are recounted in the book. But in the long run, you have to remember that the arc of the moral universe bends toward progress. It bends a lot slower than I thought it did, but still, you need to keep that in mind and realize that it's a long game. And sometimes I found also that it takes a leap of faith. It takes a leap to want to actually run for office, to actually start something, to actually start writing a book, or to write a investigative piece for a newspaper, as I did, or knock on somebody's door that you think is going to be hostile to you. But sometimes if you leap, the net will appear. I think that's a saying that someone had at one point, and I certainly have found it to be true. I never thought I would run for office after I lost my first time, and then suddenly there was an open seat. Or I would think that I had totally lost a bill that was so very important in the New Mexico legislature. And then suddenly some other legislator that I didn't even know would introduce it or pick it up in the House and run with it and pass it on the last day of a legislative session. That happened to me with a bill that I very much wanted to pass my first year, which was a bill that would mandate that insurance companies allow women who had a mastectomy to stay in the hospital at least overnight. At that time, they were doing these sort of drive-by mastectomies. It went nowhere in the Senate. It met resistance at everything. Suddenly, it snuck through to the House, and a representative that I barely knew and who I disagreed with in every possible way, especially when it came to the WIP nuclear waste dump down in Carlsbad. He was from Carlsbad. He took that bill, he resurrected it, passed it on the very last day of the session. And then, believe it or not, Gary Johnson signed it, and that's leaping, and the net appears. So that's kind of one of my messages, and so I'll just finish with that and say that that's my story. Unless you have any questions, I'm going to stick to it. And I guess there are some quick questions. So Janet, do you want to tell me what they are, or maybe
Sure. So far there was one typed into the chat from Nat
Okay.
D.
Okay.
And it was, didn't the governor get the hydrogen bill reintroduced to committee or revived in some way?
Yes, the hydrogen bill was killed in a House committee, and now I think it has popped up in the Senate, and I don't know exactly what committee it's in. But Nat, you are absolutely right, and it is not dead, and nothing is dead until the very last day of the session. And anything, and I used to just stand at my desk the last night and the last day and morning of the session, just so worried about some kind of funny business happening. And then suddenly at the last minute it would appear that there had been a toxic waste dump located in my district. So, you really have to watch out what happens during the last the last week of the legislative session, bills that you thought were dead come back, or come back as amendments to other bills when others are not watching. And so it's a dangerous time. And again, I really want to encourage you to look into the idea of how we can change this process in New Mexico so that we have a longer session to vet bills. We have more staff so that legislators are not dependent on lobbyists for information. And so that they are also paid and compensated, so they're not always in these conflicted positions where maybe they work for the Department of Energy, or maybe they work for an organization that has a bill before the legislature. That's perfectly fine in a citizen's legislature, but it gives the appearance of corruption. And that appearance alone, I think, diminishes people's faith in the legislature and in government in general. So that's one recommendation I have. It's not in this book, but it's in another book. So how about some other questions on either on the legislative session or on 10 more doors?
I think Nat might have had another question. So go ahead, Nat.
Oh, thank you. Good afternoon, Senator Feldman.
Hi, Nadine. How are you?
Hanging in there, dancing between Zooms and advocacy. I so much have enjoyed learning more about your background and more about how legislators and members of Congress are they're people, just people. And I remember being new to the legislature and wanting to advocate for the needs of people with disabilities. And I know you've heard this story before, but I'll say it again. I remember you chairing the interim committee, and I was presenting the Please Implement Money Follows the Person, which was a bill that had already been passed. And as I was giving testimony, I remember you nodding and then putting a pointer finger up and kind of circling it around vertically in the air and then nodding. And I initially felt very intimidated that I was being criticized, but I learned later that you were actually mentoring me from your seat at the front of the room. And that I learned from that legislators are human beings. They're there to help me, and I don't have to be afraid of them. So I want to thank you for that type of mentoring, not just to a citizen, but also to a woman, and also a woman with a disability.
Thank you. And thank you for being a great advocate. And we did get that bill passed. And, you know, sometimes the implementation of the things that pass is more important than actually getting it passed in the first place. So I know you're on it, and I thank you very much for your efforts.
Thank you for being a mentor to me.
You bet.
It means so much.
Thank you.
Dede, I just wanted to ask how COVID has changed the way politics is done in the last couple of years, because everything you're talking about is so face-to-face, it's so personal, and I know that's often not possible now. So where do you see the direction of it going because of COVID?
Well, there are pluses and there are minuses. Believe it, there's some pluses with COVID, because they really upped their game in the legislature to allow people to participate over Zoom in committee hearings. And that opens it up to a lot of people who were not able to travel from Deming or Roy to be at a committee hearing, especially when the committee hearings are often postponed or are late. So now you can participate by Zoom. And it was a little rusty last session, but this session, I think it's that they've got it more regularized so that you can raise your hand and be recognized in opposition or in support of bills, and then you can testify too over Zoom. So that's a good thing. I mean, I start out with the idea that legislative proceedings need to be transparent to the public, to voters, to citizens. And, you know, it's been a fight. It was a fight when I was there to get them to webcast without any question of public participation, just to get them to webcast the floor sessions. They didn't want that because they thought, you know, it would make it look bad if somebody was sleeping during debate, or that somebody could actually use their speech to campaign for office. I mean, politics that's involved in this. I thought they were ridiculous there, but it kept the Senate, in particular the Senate, from webcasting until finally it became possible when everybody had a laptop and a cell phone that they could do it themselves. So finally they were kind of embarrassed into doing this. And, you know, and I believe that all committees need to be open to the public. Conference committees, it took 12 years to get conference committees to be open to the public. Conference committees are committees that are called when there's a difference between a House bill and a Senate bill. And because, you know, bills need to pass both houses in order to go up to the governor for signature or veto. And often there are different versions. Like I was just talking about the budget, and always the budget goes to a conference committee. And those conference committees until 2009 were closed to the public, closed to the press. And so even like other members of the Senate or House didn't know what went on there. And we were just presented at the very last day with a bill that was about like this. This is the budget of New Mexico. And okay, up or down, which do you vote? And by the way, the clock is ticking. It's almost noon on the last day. So people voted yes, of course, only to find out that there were some nuggets in there that they didn't anticipate. So anyway, so Zoom has, I think, in that way, increased transparency and ability to participate. Of course, I still believe that New Mexico is a state that is based on relationships and is based on in business and in politics and in policy making. It's based on who you know and what relationships you've been able to develop. And COVID has made it more difficult for the number of new legislators who were elected and spent their first term, their first session rather, last year, without even meeting some of their fellow legislators. So if you want bipartisan communication, if you want cooperation, it's really greatly facilitated when it's in person. And I felt sorry for those legislators because they missed out on that fun too. This year there's more person-to-person stuff amongst the legislators themselves. So yeah, it's a different world with COVID. I think that some of the lobbyists were not happy with the restrictions last year about, you know, nobody could enter the roundhouse. And that denied them the access, the personal access to their marks, if you will. And so, so that's been removed now. They can go in there now. But there still is, caution and barriers. Everyone must wear masks now, which I think is a good thing, because somebody told me up there that they had 30 people test positive for COVID just fairly recently. I mean, there's a lot of staff, you think of it just as, 112 legislators, 70 in the House and 42 in the Senate. But there's hundreds of staff people there, and then press also. So it can be dangerous. All right, let's see, what else can I tell you?
I don't see any more hands raised. Oh, there we go. Nat, go ahead.
Thank you. Senator Feldman, what is your perspective on enlarging the legislative session duration to more days than 30 in the even numbered years and 60 in the odd numbered years? And with that concept also, what are your thoughts on a paid legislative body instead of a citizen-based legislative body? Thank you.
Well, on the first one, 30 days is too short. 60 days is better. It would be better to do 2 60-day sessions, I think, or maybe 1 90-day session and 1 60-day session. But there are also questions about how you organize the session itself, and whether there is a way to organize it so that all the bills don't get jammed up and are sitting on House member and senators' desks that last day. There are about 60 or 70 on the desk the last day, and they just don't get acted upon. They just die because their time ran out of time. You can do other things. You can limit the number of bills that are introduced. You can maybe have 1 week be all committee hearings and the next week be all legislative sessions that are floor sessions that are designed to get the bills into the other chamber. You can have more committee hearings before the actual sessions begin. The other states do it in many different ways, and we ought to be looking at what best practices are. And in terms of paying the legislature too. We are the only state that does not pay its legislators a salary. Legislators do get a per diem, and it's about $175 a day now for when they are in session or when they are serving on an interim committee. And they do get a pension, but that's all. They don't get a salary. They don't get, and they get some mileage. For example, in this session, a 30-day session, you are allotted 1 trip. I would be allotted 1 trip, 1 reimbursed trip between Albuquerque and Santa Fe and back. So, that's inadequate. But the problem, of course, Nat, is that all this requires constitutional amendments, and constitutional amendments are very difficult, and they have to go to the people. And also, legislators don't want to vote for a salary increase for themselves. It looks bad. It looks like they're feathering their own nest. And it looks like, that's just self-interested. So it could appear on a campaign brochure against you in the next election. So they are reluctant to vote for that. Just as legislators are reluctant to vote for any reforms that affect their campaigns or affect their conflicts of interest. And that's why it takes so long to get those reforms. So I think that the best idea, and this is incorporated in 2 bills during this session, is that there should be an independent salary commission, or maybe the ethics commission itself can look into this and set what the salary should be for legislators and other elected officials like judges, for example, so that they are on par with legislators across the country. And also, and this is the main reason why it's important to give a salary to legislators, I think, even if it's small, is that not having one limits the pool of people who are willing to serve in the legislature to those that can subsidize it themselves. And you don't get younger people. You don't get people who are working at sort of ordinary jobs where they're not the boss. But you get lawyers and realtors and insurance agents and retired people, a lot of retired people in the legislature. And, it's questionable whether that's really a representative cross-section of New Mexico. So, there are ways around it, but it takes some doing, and it takes some advocacy and some champions in the legislature that are willing to stick with it for the long haul. So, anybody else? If not, I just really want to thank you all for attending. I really appreciate it. Good luck with your own writing. I see some folks out there who are writers and artists and advocates, of course, educators. And I thank you so much for what you're doing and for tuning in today.
Thank you, Senator Feldman, very much.